In a town ruled by dust, heat, and fear, one woman arrives with nothing, but a secret powerful enough to start a war. A sheriff who's lost everything, a ruthless land baron, and a past that refuses to stay buried. The moment she steps off that train, her life is no longer hers. Because sometimes, courage isn't fighting, it's choosing not to run. If you want more stories like this, like, comment, share, and subscribe to stay with us.
The locomotive hissed like a dying beast, venting a final cloud of scalding white steam before it lurched forward. Eleanor Vance stood on the warped wooden planks of the Dusty Creek depot, the vibrations of the departing train rattling through the soles of her boots. She didn't look back. Looking back meant acknowledging the 3,000 miles of steel track that connected this desolate wasteland to the velvet cage she had just escaped in Boston. Instead, she stripped off her left silk glove. Her fingers were trembling, stained with soot and sweat, but her eyes were fixed on the 3-carat diamond ring anchoring her ring finger. It caught the brutal Nevada sun, flashing with an arrogant, mocking light. It was a fortune. It was also Arthur Pendleton's brand. With a sharp intake of breath, Ellie twisted the ring off her finger. She didn't try to pawn it. A stone that size in a town this small would draw questions, and questions drew Pinkerton agents. She walked to the edge of the platform and let it drop. The heavy platinum band hit the dirt, bounced once, and disappeared into a deep, muddy rut beside the tracks. It was gone. And so was Eleanor Vance, heiress to a shipping empire. She picked up her single worn carpet bag. It contained 2 cotton dresses, a hairbrush, and exactly $0. As the train's whistle faded into the vast, echoing canyons, the silence of the frontier crashed down on her. It wasn't empty. It was heavy. The midday heat was a physical weight, pressing against her shoulders and turning the heavy wool of her East Coast traveling suit into an oven. Ellie took a step toward what looked like the main street, a haphazard collection of sun-bleached timber buildings, a general store, and a saloon with swinging doors that looked like they hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the Civil War. Just put one foot in front of the other, she told herself. Find work, find water, survive. She made it exactly 20 yards. The adrenaline that had fueled her for 5 days of relentless paranoid travel finally evaporated. The blistering sun beat down relentlessly, baking the moisture from her throat. The horizon tilted. The dusty street spun into a blur of blinding beige and white. Her knees buckled. She braced for the harsh impact of the baked earth, but it never came. A shadow eclipsed the blinding glare, dropping the temperature by 10 degrees in an instant. A hand, large and rough as sanded oak, gripped her upper arm, steadying her with effortless strength. Ellie gasped, her head snapping up. He was tall, impossibly tall, and blocked out the sun entirely. A low-brimmed Stetson cast his face in sharp angles of shadow and grit. He wore a gray canvas duster coated in a layer of pale road dust, and pinned to his chest was a tarnished silver star. Sheriff Silas Thorne didn't ask if she was all right. Men in the West rarely asked questions they already knew the answers to. His pale, flinty eyes swept over her with agonizing precision. He took in the fine, ruined fabric of her dress, the absence of a return ticket sticking out of her bag, and the desperate, cornered animal panic flashing in her eyes. "Let go of me," Ellie choked out, her voice raspy from the dry air. She tried to pull her arm away, putting up a front of Bostonian indignation. "I'm perfectly fine. I am just passing through." He didn't release her. Instead, his grip shifted, gentling just enough to keep her upright without bruising her skin. "No, you aren't." His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate straight through her boots. "The westbound just left. The eastbound doesn't come for 3 days. You've got no money, no water, and you're wearing wool in 110-degree heat." Ellie swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I said I'm fine. I can take care of myself." Silas looked past her, his gaze briefly catching the glint of the discarded diamond ring half buried in the mud near the tracks, then returned to her face. He understood instantly. He had seen runaways before, though rarely ones with cheekbones like hers and a stubbornness that rivaled a wild Mustang. He let out a slow breath, the rigid line of his jaw shifting. He reached down and scooped up her heavy carpet bag with his free hand, hoisting it as if it weighed nothing. "Hey, that's mine. And it's going to Cora's boarding house along with you before you drop dead in my street and give me paperwork to fill out," Silas said, turning her gently but firmly toward the shade of the boardwalk. Ellie planted her feet, looking up at him with a fierce, terrified defiance. "I told you, Sheriff. I'm moving on. I don't belong here." Silas stopped. He looked down at her, the harshness in his eyes softening into something she couldn't quite name. Something tired, protective, and completely unyielding. "You've been running from something," Silas said, his voice dropping to a quiet rumble that effectively drowned out the rest of the world. "I can see it on you. But the running stops at my town line." He tilted his head, his gaze locking onto hers. "This is where you belong." He didn't mean it as a romantic declaration. He meant she was under his protection now, whether she liked it or not. But as the Nevada wind kicked up, swirling the dust around their boots, Ellie felt a strange, terrifying jolt in her chest. For the first time in her life, someone was standing between her and the world. And for the first time in 5 days, she let herself be led into the shade. The harsh, unyielding light of a Nevada morning did not care for the delicate sensibilities of Boston runaways. It punched through the thin flour-sack curtains of Cora's boarding house, striking Eleanor Vance directly in the eyes. She woke with a gasp, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. For a fraction of a second, she expected the suffocating velvet drapes of her Beacon Hill bedroom. Instead, she inhaled the scent of lye soap, chicory coffee, and old pine. Dusty Creek. Ellie sat up, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. Her fine traveling suit, now draped over a ladder-back chair, was ruined beyond repair, permanently stained with the rust-colored dust of the frontier. She swung her legs over the side of the narrow cot, her bare feet hitting the uneven floorboards. She had survived her first night in the West. Downstairs, the boarding house was already alive with the sounds of clinking cast-iron pans and gruff voices. Ellie quickly washed her face in the ceramic basin, pinned her dark hair back into a severe, practical knot, and donned the simpler of her 2 cotton dresses. She left her silver family locket, the only piece of her mother she had left, tucked safely beneath the high collar of her bodice. When she descended the creaking stairs, she found Cora in the kitchen, a formidable woman with iron-gray hair, a flour-dusted apron, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. "You're awake," Cora said, not looking up from the massive bowl of biscuit dough she was kneading. "Sheriff Thorne said you'd sleep till noon after the heat exhaustion. Man thinks he knows everything." "I don't sleep in," Ellie replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And I don't take charity. How much for the room and the board, Cora?" Cora stopped kneading and wiped her hands on her apron. She studied Ellie, taking in the pale skin, the refined posture, and the stubborn tilt of her chin. 50 cents a day. But I wager by the lack of weight in that carpetbag of yours, you ain't got it." "I can work," Cora snorted. "Your hands look like they've never held anything heavier than a silver spoon. But we're short-handed. The schoolhouse at the end of town has been shuttered since the spring. Town council hasn't had the funds or the spine to clean it up since the last teacher got run off. You want to earn your keep? You clean it out, prep it for the fall. It's grueling work, dust, rats, and rot." "I'll do it," Ellie said without a second of hesitation. An hour later, equipped with a bucket, a stiff bristled brush, and a bundle of rags, Ellie stood before the Dusty Creek schoolhouse. It was a tragic, slumped building at the edge of town, its white paint peeling away like sunburned skin. The porch groaned ominously under her boots as she pushed the heavy oak door open. The heat inside was stifling, smelling of trapped air, dry rot, and mice. Desks were overturned, the blackboard was clouded with chalk dust, and dirt coated every conceivable surface. It was a massive, overwhelming task. It was exactly what she needed. Ellie rolled up her sleeves, tied a rag over her nose and mouth, and went to work. For hours, she scrubbed, swept, and hauled out debris. She let the physical agony of the labor drown out the memories of Arthur Pendleton's cold, demanding voice and her father's indifferent silence. With every bucket of dirty water she tossed out the back door, she felt a microscopic fraction of her past wash away. By early afternoon, her palms were screaming, covered in raw, weeping blisters, and her muscles trembled with exhaustion, but the floor was beginning to show the warm grain of the wood beneath the grime. She was sweeping near the large stone hearth when the toe of her boot caught on a raised, splintered floorboard. Ellie tripped, catching herself against the rough stone of the chimney. She cursed softly, kneeling to inspect the damage. The nail had rusted completely through, leaving the thick oak plank loose. Intending to press it back down, she wedged her fingers into the gap. Instead of hitting solid joists, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. Frowning, Ellie grabbed the rusted iron fireplace poker and used it as a lever. With a loud creak and a shower of ancient dust, the floorboard popped up. Nestled in the hollow space between the floor and the earth below was a tarnished tin lockbox. Ellie pulled it out. The small brass padlock was heavily corroded. A solid strike with the heavy end of the iron poker shattered the brittle lock. She threw the lid back. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a stack of yellowed, heavy parchment. She carefully unfolded the top document. Her eyes scanned the elegant, looping calligraphy. Because her father had groomed her to marry a corporate titan, Ellie had been forced to understand the dense language of contracts, ledgers, and property law. It took her less than a minute to realize exactly what she was holding. It was the original 1861 land charter for Dusty Creek, and stapled behind it was the topographical deed to the schoolhouse property. Her breath hitched in her throat. According to this document, the schoolhouse property didn't just encompass the lot the building stood on. It extended a half-mile north, encompassing the entire natural spring and the creek access that fed the valley. The water belonged to the school. It belonged to the public trust. "You're making a mess of your dress, East Coast." Ellie jumped, spinning around. Silas Thorne stood in the open doorway, blocking the harsh afternoon sun. His thumbs were hooked into his gun belt, his duster pushed back to reveal the heavy Colt revolver resting on his hip. He moved with a terrifying silence for a man of his size. "Sheriff," Ellie breathed, hastily trying to fold the parchment. Silas's eyes narrowed, tracking her frantic movements. He stepped into the room, his heavy boots echoing on the newly cleaned floorboards. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as he approached. "What did you find?" "Nothing, just some old papers." "You're a terrible liar," he said, his voice a low rumble. He stopped mere inches from her, his sheer proximity forcing her to look straight up into his shadowed face. He held out a large, calloused hand. "Hand it over." "It's the property of the school," Ellie said, clutching the papers to her chest, her chin lifting defiantly. "I don't believe it falls under the jurisdiction of the law." Silas didn't argue. He simply reached out, his fingers closing over the edge of the parchment. He didn't use force, but the implicit threat of his strength was enough. He tugged it gently from her grasp and stepped back to read it. As his eyes scanned the 1861 date and the boundary lines, the rugged planes of his face hardened into something resembling carved granite. A muscle feathered at the edge of his jaw. "Where did you find this?" he demanded, his voice dropping an octave. "Under the floorboards by the hearth," Ellie said, bewildered by his sudden, intense anger. "It proves the town owns the water access. I heard Cora complaining this morning that the cattle baron Judson Croft is trying to buy up the North Ridge. This proves he can't. The water belongs to the school." "You have no idea what you're holding," Silas practically growled. He folded the paper roughly and shoved it inside his duster. "Judson Croft has been lobbying the territorial judge for 6 months to have this exact land declared abandoned so he can annex it. He controls the beef, which means he controls the economy. He's been looking for this deed to destroy it. If he knows it exists, he won't use a lawyer to get it. He'll use men with rifles." Ellie's blood ran cold, but she refused to back down. "Then we take it to the Capitol. We register it officially." "No, we don't do anything," Silas snapped, stepping into her space again. The scent of him, leather, tobacco, and sun-baked dust, wrapped around her. I am going to take this and lock it in the deepest safe in my jail. And you are going to forget you ever saw it. You understand me? Croft has burned out homesteaders for less. I will not have your blood on my streets. It's the town's future, Sheriff, Ellie argued, her temper flaring. If Croft takes the water, the town dies. You're the law. Do your job and protect it. Silas leaned down, his face inches from hers, his eyes flashing with a dark, haunted fury. My job is keeping people alive in a place that wants them dead. You think you're brave because you ran away from some parlor in Boston? This is the frontier. Bravery gets you a shallow grave. You keep your mouth shut about this deed. He turned on his heel and strode out of the schoolhouse, the door slamming shut behind him with a resonant boom that shook dust from the rafters. Ellie stood alone in the dim room, her chest heaving. She had spent her entire life being told what to do by arrogant, powerful men. She wasn't about to start taking orders from a small-town sheriff, no matter how intimidating his glare was. She returned to her scrubbing, a new, fiery determination burning in her chest. The next morning, Ellie arrived at the schoolhouse early, her muscles aching but her resolve hardened. She carried a small basket of supplies from Cora. As she climbed the porch steps, she noticed the front door was slightly ajar. Frowning, she pushed it open. A sharp gasp tore from her throat, and the basket slipped from her blistered fingers, crashing to the floor. The heavy oak teacher's podium, which she had spent an hour polishing the day before, was destroyed. It had been hacked to splinters, the deep, violent gouges of an axe scarring the wood. But it was the blackboard that made her stomach violently heave. Nailed to the center of the slate board with a rusted railroad spike was a massive rattlesnake. It was thick as a man's forearm, its scales glinting in the morning light. And it was missing its head. Beneath it, scrawled in thick, dripping red paint, or perhaps blood, were two words: "Leave it." Ellie stumbled back against the doorframe, her hand flying to her mouth. The sheer physical violence of the threat radiated through the quiet room. Her knees shook, the sophisticated bravery of the East Coast dissolving into the visceral terror of the Wild West. But as she stared at the mutilated snake, the terror slowly coalesced into something else, something cold and sharp. She reached down, picked up her fallen basket, and stepped over the threshold. Silas Thorne did not run. It was a rule he lived by, an image he maintained to project absolute, unshakable control over Dusty Creek. But when the young stable boy sprinted into the sheriff's office stammering about Miss Vance and blood on the blackboard, Silas was out the door and moving down Main Street at a pace that made men step quickly out of his way. He took the porch steps of the schoolhouse two at a time and threw the door wide open. His hand was already curled around the grip of his Colt. He expected to find her weeping or hysterical or packing her bags. Instead, he found Eleanor Vance standing in the center of the room, her sleeves rolled up, methodically using a crowbar to pry the railroad spike out of the blackboard. The headless snake dropped to the floor with a sickening, heavy thud. Ellie flinched, her face deathly pale, but she immediately reached for a rag and a bucket of water to begin scrubbing the red warning off the slate. Silas froze, the adrenaline crashing against his ribs. He let out a harsh breath, stepping fully into the room. "Drop the rag," he commanded, his voice tight. Ellie didn't look at him. She scrubbed harder, the wet rag smearing the crimson letters into a pink haze. "It stains if you let it set into the porous slate," she said, her voice shaking with a terrifying, rigidly controlled calm. Silas crossed the room in 3 massive strides. He grabbed the bucket and tossed it aside, water splashing across the floorboards. He caught her wrists, halting her frantic scrubbing. "I said, drop it!" Ellie finally looked up at him. Her eyes were wide, overbright with unshed tears of pure, unadulterated shock, but her jaw was locked in defiance. When she looked at the mess on the floor, a violent shudder ripped through her small frame. Silas's grip on her wrists softened immediately. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a heavy, suffocating guilt. He had known Croft was ruthless, but he hadn't expected the Baron to move this fast or this viciously against a woman. "I told you," Silas said quietly, his thumbs absently brushing over the angry red blisters on her palms. "I told you what kind of men operate out here." "Who is he?" Ellie whispered, staring at the snake. "Judson Croft. He owns the Double C Ranch just outside of town. He must have had a man watching the schoolhouse yesterday. He knows you found something." Silas released her wrists and picked up the snake by its tail, tossing it into an empty feed sack he found in the corner. He picked up the axe that had been left buried in the floorboards. "Go back to Cora's. I'm boarding this place up." "No." Silas turned, staring at her as if she had lost her mind. "Miss Vance, I am not leaving," Ellie said, her voice finding its steel. "If I run away because he hacked up a desk, he wins. He gets the water. He gets the town. And I go back to being a girl who runs away when the men around her get violent." She stepped toward him, looking up into his imposing face. "I'm done running, Sheriff." Silas looked at her for a long, quiet moment. He saw the aristocratic cut of her features, the fine bearing of a woman raised in high society, but beneath it he saw a spine made of iron. It was a dangerous combination. It was the kind of combination that got under a man's skin. "Fine," Silas grunted, turning away before she could see the reluctant admiration in his eyes. "But you don't stay here after sundown, and you don't walk back to the boarding house alone." Across the street, lounging on the second-story balcony of the Golden Spur Saloon, Judson Croft watched the exchange through the open doors of the schoolhouse. Croft was a man who appreciated fine things, fine bourbon, prime cattle, and absolute power. He struck a match against the wooden railing and lit his cigar, his pale, predatory eyes fixed on the slim figure of the new schoolmarm. He had ordered his men to leave the snake to scare her off. He expected her to be on the noon stagecoach. Instead, she was standing her ground against Sheriff Thorne, a man Croft had been trying to get rid of for 3 years. As Croft watched, Ellie stepped out onto the porch to shake out a dusty rug. A sudden gust of the arid Nevada wind whipped down the street, catching the collar of her dress. The fabric pulled back, and a heavy silver locket swung free, catching the morning sunlight. Croft's eyes narrowed. He possessed a photographic memory for details, especially details that could yield a profit. He pulled a folded piece of paper from the inner pocket of his tailored vest. It was a wire he had received from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency a week ago, circulated to all prominent businessmen in the territory. "Wanted for return, Miss Eleanor Vance, heir to the Vance shipping fortune. Fled Boston on the 14th. Generous bounty of $5,000 offered by Mr. Arthur Pendleton for information leading to her safe return." Croft looked at the sketch on the wire, then back at the woman on the porch. The dark hair, the aristocratic bearing, the silver locket bearing a V-shaped crest. A slow, wicked smile spread across Croft's face. He took a long drag of his cigar. He didn't need to kill the new schoolmarm to get the deed back. He just needed to send a telegram to Boston. Let her furious fiancé do the dirty work, and Croft would collect the bounty and the water rights in one clean sweep. That night, the desert air turned instantly frigid the moment the sun dipped below the jagged horizon. The sky was a vast, bruised purple, littered with stars that looked sharp enough to cut glass. Ellie sat on the back steps of Cora's boarding house, wrapping a knitted shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her hands ached, her back throbbed, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the headless snake. But she forced herself to sit in the dark, refusing to let the fear confine her to her room. A heavy footstep sounded on the gravel. She didn't jump. She had already learned to recognize the deliberate, unhurried rhythm of Silas Thorne's gait. He emerged from the shadows, his Winchester rifle resting casually over his shoulder. The moonlight cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the slight crook in his nose. "You're supposed to be inside," he said, stopping at the base of the stairs. "I couldn't sleep. It's too hot indoors and too cold out here." Ellie offered him a small, weary smile. "You're patrolling the boarding house now?" "I patrol the town," Silas replied smoothly. though the fact that he had circled Cora's property 3 times in the last hour wasn't lost on either of them. He set the rifle against the porch railing and pulled a small pouch of tobacco from his vest, expertly rolling a cigarette with one hand. He struck a match. The flare of orange light illuminated his eyes, and for a moment Ellie saw a profound, bone-deep exhaustion there. "Why do you care so much, Silas?" she asked softly, using his given name for the first time. The night air seemed to strip away the formalities of the daylight. "Most sheriffs I read about in the penny dreadfuls take the Baron's money and look the other way." Silas took a drag of his cigarette, exhaling a thin stream of smoke into the cold air. He looked out into the darkness, silent for so long Ellie thought he wasn't going to answer. "5 years ago, I was a deputy in a mining town up north," Silas said, his voice stripped of its usual gruff authority, leaving something raw and hollow behind. "There was a syndicate trying to buy out the local claims. They used threats, intimidation. I told the miners to stand their ground. I told them the law would protect them." Ellie watched him, her breath catching at the profound sadness settling over his broad shoulders. "The syndicate didn't come after the miners," Silas continued, his gaze fixed on a point in the black desert only he could see. "They came to my cabin while I was out on patrol, set the perimeter on fire. My wife, Sarah, and my little boy, they didn't make it out." The words hit Ellie like a physical blow. She covered her mouth with her hand, a soft gasp escaping her lips. "Silas, I am so sorry." "The West doesn't negotiate with good intentions, Ellie," he said, turning his head to look at her. The moonlight caught the fierce, protective fire burning in his pale eyes. "It buries them. I couldn't save my family because I underestimated the greed of bad men. I won't make that mistake in my town again. And I won't let Judson Croft make a casualty out of you over a piece of paper." He stepped closer to the stairs. The physical distance between them vanished. He reached out, his large, rough hand gently taking hers. He turned her hand over, his thumb lightly brushing the bandages Cora had applied to her blistered palms. The touch was electric. A sudden, intense heat flared in Ellie's chest, completely overriding the cold night air. The sheer contrast between the violence Silas was capable of and the incredible gentleness of his touch sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Silas looked down at her hands, then slowly up to her eyes. The air between them grew thick, heavy with unspoken things. He was a man who had sworn off feeling anything, and she was a woman fleeing the very concept of belonging to a man. Yet, standing in the moonlit dust, neither of them pulled away. "I'm not a casualty, Silas," Ellie whispered, her gaze locked on his mouth. "I can fight." "I know you can," he murmured, his thumb stroking the inside of her wrist, feeling the rapid, frantic flutter of her pulse. "But as long as you're in Dusty Creek, you don't fight alone." For a long, suspended moment, the rest of the world ceased to exist. But miles away, in the telegraph office at the edge of the county, the relentless clicking of the brass key shattered the night. The operator transcribed the message Judson Croft had paid handsomely to send, routing it directly to a private estate in Boston, Massachusetts. "Arthur Pendleton. The runaway is in Dusty Creek. Come collect your property." The trap was set, and the East Coast was coming to claim its due. The Nevada sun was a relentless, unblinking eye, baking the earth of the limestone basin a mile outside of Dusty Creek until the ground cracked like old porcelain. Heat shimmered above the scrub brush in wavy, translucent ribbons. Ellie stood in the center of the clearing, the heavy, blued steel Colt .45 feeling alien and massive in her blistered hands. "You're gripping it like it's a teacup, Ellie. It's a tool, not a piece of fine china. It has a job to do and you have to tell it how." Silas Thorne's voice was a low, steady gravel that cut through the oppressive heat. He stood a few paces away, his thumbs hooked loosely into his gun belt, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He had dragged her out here before noon, declaring that if Judson Croft was leaving decapitated snakes as calling cards, a locked door wasn't going to be enough to keep her alive. She needed to know how to shoot. "It weighs half as much as I do," Ellie muttered, struggling to keep the long barrel level. Her shoulders ached, and sweat gathered at the nape of her neck, soaking into the collar of her faded cotton dress. "And the grip is too wide for my hands." Silas didn't sigh. He didn't exhibit a single ounce of the frustrated impatience she was used to receiving from the men in Boston when she failed to instantly grasp a concept. Instead, he closed the distance between them with that silent, predatory grace of his. "Drop your arms," he instructed. Ellie let the heavy gun sink, her muscles burning with relief. Silas stepped behind her. The sudden, overwhelming proximity of him made her breath catch shallowly in her throat. She could feel the solid, immovable wall of his chest just inches from her back, radiating a furnace-like heat that rivaled the desert sun. He smelled of leather, lye soap, and the sharp, clean scent of sage. "Square your feet," he murmured, his voice dropping right beside her ear. A shiver raced down her spine despite the 100-degree weather. "Shoulder width apart. Root yourself to the dirt. You can't let the recoil knock you backward." She shifted her boots in the dust, trying to focus on his instructions rather than the mesmerizing cadence of his breathing. Silas reached out, his large, calloused hands covering hers. His fingers were rough, mapped with scars from a lifetime of frontier survival, but his touch was incredibly deliberate. He lifted her arms, raising the heavy Colt until it was level with her eyeline. "Keep your elbows unlocked. Stiff joints will snap," he murmured. He stepped even closer, his chest now brushing lightly against her back to adjust her posture. The physical contact was electric. Ellie's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, completely drowning out the ambient hum of the cicadas. "Support the grip with your left hand. Let your right hand do the thinking." He guided her thumb to the hammer. "Pull it back." Click-clack. The mechanical sound was stark and lethal in the quiet canyon. "Now," Silas said, his cheek hovering just a fraction of an inch from her temple as he looked down the barrel with her. "Look at the tin can on that stump. Don't look at the gun. Look at the target. Breathe in." Ellie inhaled a shaky breath, her lungs expanding against the rigid cage of her ribs. "Hold it." His voice was a hypnotic command. "When you pull the trigger, don't jerk it. Squeeze it slow, like you're wringing out a sponge. Let the gunshot surprise you." Ellie focused on the dented peach can 50 yards away. The weight of the gun, the heat of the sun, the terrifying reality of Judson Croft. It all funneled down into the tiny front sight of the revolver. And surrounding it all was Silas. His strength wrapping around her, offering a shield she had never asked for but desperately craved. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening. The gun bucked violently in her hands, spitting fire and white smoke. The recoil sent a shockwave up her arms, and she stumbled backward. Silas was there, his hands catching her waist instantly, absorbing her momentum and keeping her on her feet. His grip was firm and anchoring. Ellie blinked through the ringing in her ears and the sulphurous smoke. She peered at the stump. The tin can remained perfectly, mockingly untouched. A puff of dust rose from the dirt bank 10 feet to the left of the target. "I missed," she breathed, her shoulders slumping. "You survived the recoil. That's step one," Silas said, his hands lingering on her waist for a fraction of a second longer than necessary before he stepped back. The sudden absence of his body heat left her feeling strangely untethered. "You anticipated the loud noise. You flinched right before you fired, dragging the barrel down. Try again." For the next hour, the canyon echoed with the rhythmic thunder of gunfire. Ellie's hands grew raw, a dark bruise blossoming on the webbing of her thumb, but the stubborn pride that had kept her alive all the way from Massachusetts refused to let her quit. Silas remained a constant, steadying presence. He corrected her stance, reloaded the heavy cylinder, and offered quiet, sparse words of encouragement that meant more than any poetry she had ever read. "Breathe," he commanded, as she leveled the gun for the 12th time. "Take the time the world gives you. Nothing else exists but the front sight and the target." Ellie blocked out the ache in her arms. She blocked out her father's sneering face and Arthur's cold, dead eyes. She focused entirely on the tin can. She squeezed the trigger. Crack! The tin can violently launched off the stump, spinning through the air before clattering into the rocks. "I hit it," Ellie gasped, lowering the smoking gun, a genuine luminous smile breaking across her dirt-smudged face. She turned to Silas, her eyes shining with the pure, intoxicating thrill of agency. "I actually hit it." Silas looked down at her. The hard, stoic lines of his face had softened entirely. For the first time since she had met him on the train platform, the shadows receded from his pale eyes. A slow, breathtaking smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, transforming his rugged features into something devastatingly handsome. "You hit it," he agreed softly. The air between them suddenly shifted, the atmosphere thickening into something heavy and magnetic. The adrenaline from the gunfire morphed instantly into a different, far more dangerous kind of tension. Silas stepped toward her, the space between them evaporating. He reached out, taking the hot revolver from her trembling fingers and sliding it seamlessly into his own holster. His eyes dropped to her lips, parted and panting in the heat. Ellie looked up at him, her pulse drumming a frantic beat in her throat. The wildness of the frontier seemed to strip away all the polite society rules she had been raised with. She didn't want to retreat. She wanted to step closer. She wanted to know if his mouth was as rough as his hands. Silas raised his hand, his knuckles lightly grazing the line of her jaw, sweeping a stray lock of dark, sweat-dampened hair behind her ear. He leaned in, the scent of him intoxicating, his gaze burning with a restrained, desperate hunger. "Ellie," he murmured, the name a rough prayer on his lips. Thwack, crack. The sound was utterly different from the boom of the Colt. It was the sharp, high-velocity whip of a rifle bullet breaking the sound barrier. Before Ellie could even process the noise, the glass whiskey bottle resting on a rock 3 feet to their right exploded into 1,000 glittering shards. Silas didn't hesitate. In a blur of motion, he lunged forward, tackling Ellie to the ground. His massive weight covered her completely, pressing her face into the hot, abrasive dirt, as a second bullet ricocheted off the limestone face behind them with a deadly whine. "Stay down!" Silas roared, rolling slightly to draw his Colt in a lightning-fast draw. Ellie gasped for air, her heart trying to tear its way out of her chest. She looked up and saw a sickening splash of crimson rapidly spreading across the left shoulder of Silas's gray duster. "Silas, you're bleeding!" she screamed over the ringing in her ears. "It's a graze. Keep your head in the dirt." His eyes scanned the high ridgeline to the east, his jaw locked in a rictus of pure lethal fury. He didn't return fire. The sniper was too far out of range for a handgun concealed in the jagged rocks. They lay there in the suffocating heat for 5 agonizing minutes. The silence stretched, thick and terrifying. No more shots came. Silas finally lowered the hammer of his gun, his chest heaving against her back. He pushed himself up to a crouch, his eyes never leaving the ridge. He grabbed Ellie by the back of her dress and hauled her to her feet, shoving her toward the cover of their waiting horses. "Mount up," he barked, his voice stripped of all the warmth it had held moments ago. It was the voice of a man preparing for war. "They were trying to kill us," Ellie stammered, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the saddle horn. Silas swung up onto his black gelding, his face a mask of cold, terrifying resolve as he pressed a hand to his bleeding shoulder. "No," he said grimly. "If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead. Croft hired a professional. That wasn't an assassination." He looked at the shattered glass twinkling in the dirt, then at Ellie. That was a final warning. The mood in Dusty Creek had shifted from a simmer to a low, dangerous boil. 3 days had passed since the sniper's bullet had torn through Silas's shoulder in the canyon. Ellie sat at the scarred wooden table in the back of the sheriff's office, carefully winding a fresh boiled linen bandage around Silas's bicep. The bullet had taken a clean gouge out of the flesh, painful but not crippling. Silas sat in silence, staring out the barred window at the dusty street. He had barely spoken to her since the incident. The brief, fiery vulnerability they had shared just before the gunshot had been entirely sealed away behind his badge and his duty. He was calculating, preparing, waiting for Croft's next move. "You need to keep this dry," Ellie murmured, tying the bandage off with practiced, gentle fingers. "And stop using your left arm to haul firewood for Cora. The stitches will tear." "I heal fast," Silas said flatly, pulling his shirt back over his broad shoulders. He turned to look at her, the shadows deep in his eyes. "You shouldn't be here, Ellie. You should be inside the boarding house." "If Croft's men want to shoot me, they can shoot through a window as easily as they can shoot me in the street," she replied, refusing to shrink under his intense gaze. "I'm not going to hide." Before Silas could formulate a rebuttal, the heavy, rhythmic thud of multiple horses entering town echoed through the open door. It wasn't the irregular, scuffling gait of local ranchers or cowhands. It was the synchronized, heavy marching step of a coordinated unit. Silas stood up instantly, his hand dropping to the butt of his revolver. He moved to the door, Ellie stepping up cautiously right behind him. A procession was moving down Main Street, cutting through the stifling afternoon heat. There were 8 riders in total. 7 of them were men in matching dark suits and bowler hats, armed with repeating rifles, slung openly across their saddles. They moved with a cold, military precision that made the townsfolk stop and back away onto the boardwalks. But it was the man leading them that made the blood freeze entirely in Ellie's veins. He rode a magnificent chestnut thoroughbred that looked absurdly out of place in the Nevada dust. He wore a pristine, tailored charcoal suit, a silver pocket watch chain gleaming against his silk vest. His posture was rigid, his blonde hair slicked back, his aristocratic face arranged into an expression of supreme, bored disdain. It was Arthur Pendleton. Ellie staggered backward, bumping into Silas's desk. Her breath vanished. The walls of the sheriff's office suddenly felt like the velvet-lined walls of her father's parlor in Boston, closing in, crushing her. The nightmare she had run 3,000 miles to escape had just ridden up to her front door. "Pinkertons," Silas muttered, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the armed men. "Corporate mercenaries. What the hell are they doing in my town?" Arthur halted his horse directly in front of the Golden Spur Saloon. Judson Croft stepped out onto the balcony, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across his face. Croft tipped his hat. Arthur offered a curt, businesslike nod in return. The alliance was obvious. Croft had sold her out. Arthur dismounted gracefully, handing his reins to a Pinkerton guard. He didn't bother dusting off his coat. He turned his cold, pale blue eyes toward the sheriff's office. He had seen her through the open door. Arthur walked across the dusty street, his polished leather shoes leaving sharp impressions in the dirt. He stopped at the threshold of the office, flanked by 2 heavily armed guards. Silas stepped squarely into the doorway, his massive frame completely blocking Arthur's path. "State your business, stranger. You and your private army are blocking my street." Arthur looked Silas up and down with the kind of sneering amusement usually reserved for a slow-witted servant. "I have no quarrel with you, Sheriff. I am here to collect stolen property." "Nobody in this town steals," Silas said, his voice a low, lethal warning. "And we don't take kindly to armed men riding in uninvited. Turn your horses around." Arthur chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He didn't look at Silas. He looked past his broad shoulder directly at the pale, trembling woman huddled in the shadows of the room. "Did you really think you could run from me, my dear?" Arthur's voice was smooth, cultured, and laced with absolute malice. "It took a few weeks, but your father's money is quite persuasive, as is mine." He offered a mocking, theatrical bow. "It's time to come home. Eleanor Vance." The name hung in the sweltering air like a death sentence. Silas went completely still. The tension in his shoulders spiked. his spine going rigid. Slowly, he turned his head to look back at Ellie. "Eleanor Vance," Silas repeated. The words tasted like ash. Ellie stepped forward, her hands shaking, her eyes pleading with him. "Silas, please, let me explain." "The Vance shipping fortune," Silas interrupted, his voice dropping into a register of terrifying emptiness. He wasn't looking at a woman he was beginning to care for anymore. He was looking at a stranger, a liar. "You aren't a runaway girl looking for a fresh start. You're an East Coast heiress." "I had to lie," Ellie cried, tears finally breaking free and tracking through the dust on her cheeks. "If I used my real name, he would have found me faster. He's trying to force me into a marriage to control my mother's trust fund. He's a monster, Silas." "And you brought him here," Silas said. The betrayal in his eyes was absolute. It wasn't just about the lie of her name. It was the devastating realization of what that lie meant. Silas's core, bleeding wound, the trauma that had defined him for 5 years, was ripped wide open. The last time someone had kept secrets from him, the last time someone had hidden the true nature of the threat they carried, the syndicate had burned his cabin down with his wife and child inside. Secrets in the West weren't just polite fictions. They were fatal. "You brought a squad of Pinkertons and a billionaire into a town already fighting a land war," Silas continued, his voice devoid of all emotion. It was the chilling, mechanical tone of a lawman calculating casualties. "You brought the fire right to our front door." "Sheriff," Arthur interrupted, drawing a silver cigar case from his breast pocket, "my fiancée is prone to dramatics. It's a medical condition. Hysteria. Her father and I have been terribly worried. You have harbored her, which I suppose I should thank you for. But she is leaving with me now. We have a train to catch in Reno." "I will never go back with you, Arthur," Ellie spat, her fear momentarily eclipsed by blinding rage. "I will die in the dirt before I let you touch my inheritance." Arthur's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of the sadistic cruelty she remembered so well. He snapped the cigar case shut with a sharp clack. "You will sign the transfer papers, Eleanor. And you will be my wife," Arthur said softly, taking a step closer to the door. "Mr. Croft and I had a very illuminating telegraph exchange. He tells me the town's water deed has suddenly vanished. And he tells me that if I don't leave this town with you by tomorrow night, he's going to stop playing nice." Arthur looked at Silas, his eyes gleaming with dark intent. "Croft said to tell you, Sheriff, that if Eleanor isn't on my train, he's going to burn this entire pathetic stretch of shacks to the ground, every man, woman, and child." Ellie gasped. "You can't do that." "I am merely a messenger, my dear," Arthur said smoothly, stepping back into the sunlight. "You have until tomorrow night to pack your bags and sign the papers. After that, well, I imagine the desert gets very bright when it burns." Arthur turned and walked back to his horse, his Pinkertons forming a protective wall around him as they marched toward the saloon to drink Judson Croft's whiskey. Silence descended on the sheriff's office, heavy and suffocating. Ellie stared at Silas's broad back. He stood in the doorway, his hands balled into fists so tight his knuckles were bone white. "Silas," she whispered, stepping toward him, reaching out to touch his arm. He flinched away from her hand as if she had burned him. He didn't yell, he didn't berate her. He simply turned his head, looking at her with eyes that were as cold and dead as a winter storm. The invisible wall that had begun to crumble in the canyon had slammed back into place, thicker and higher than ever before. "Go to the boarding house, Miss Vance," Silas said, the formal title cutting deeper than a knife. "Pack your bags. I'll have a deputy escort you to the edge of town tomorrow." "You're giving me to him?" Ellie breathed, her heart shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You're just going to let him take me?" "I am the sheriff of Dusty Creek," Silas said, turning his face back toward the dusty, dangerous street. "My job is to protect this town. I can't protect it from a war you started with a lie." He stepped off the boardwalk and walked away, his gray duster snapping in the arid wind, leaving Ellie entirely alone in the shadows, trapped between the ghost of her past and the shattered ruins of her future. The pendulum clock in the hallway of Cora's boarding house ticked with the heavy rhythmic finality of an executioner's drum. It was 11:40 at night, 20 minutes until Arthur Pendleton's ultimatum expired. Ellie sat on the edge of her narrow cot, staring at the manila envelope resting on the patchwork quilt. Inside were the legal documents transferring control of her $42,000 inheritance, along with a pristine first-class train ticket back to Boston. A single signature was all it would take to save Dusty Creek, a single stroke of a pen to surrender her soul and lock herself back inside a cage she would never ever escape again. The desert night outside the window was unnaturally still. The cicadas had stopped singing. Even the wind had died down, as if the Nevada territory itself was holding its breath. She thought of Silas. She thought of the absolute, devastating betrayal in his pale eyes when Arthur had spoken her real name. She had brought the monsters of her past directly to his doorstep, validating every nightmare that kept him awake at night. He had told her he couldn't protect the town from a war she had started with a lie. But as Ellie looked at the pen resting beside the envelope, a fierce, white-hot rebellion flared in her chest. If I sign this, Arthur wins, Croft wins, and Silas loses the town anyway. Men like Croft and Arthur didn't honor bargains. They consumed everything in their path until nothing was left. Ellie stood up. She grabbed the manila envelope, marched over to the small wash basin, and shoved the documents into the stagnant water, watching the ink instantly bleed and blur into a dark, illegible mess. She was not going back. Suddenly, the scent of sulfur and kerosene spiked sharply in the air. Ellie's head snapped toward the window. A heartbeat later, the glass pane shattered inward as a blazing torch was hurled through the opening. The flaming brand hit the braided rug in the center of her room, the kerosene splashing outward and igniting the dry floorboards in a terrifying, instantaneous whoosh of orange fire. "Fire!" a voice screamed from the street below. "They're burning the town!" Ellie threw her arms up to shield her face from the sudden, blistering heat. She bolted for the door, yanking it open to find the hallway rapidly filling with thick, acrid black smoke. Cora was already on the landing, her nightgown billowing as she furiously banged a cast-iron skillet against the wooden banister to wake the remaining boarders. "Get out! Everyone out the back!" Cora bellowed, coughing as the smoke thickened. Ellie grabbed Cora's arm, helping the older woman navigate the stairs as the flames from the second floor began to eat through the ceiling joists. They burst through the back kitchen door and out into the cool, chaotic night air. Dusty Creek had descended into pure, unadulterated hell. Riders on horseback were tearing up and down Main Street. Arthur's Pinkertons and Croft's ranch hands had formed a deadly coalition. They weren't just burning buildings, they were shooting at the water barrels, destroying the town's only means of fighting the blaze. The Golden Spur Saloon was untouched, but the general store, the livery, and the schoolhouse at the end of the street were fully engulfed in roaring walls of flame. The fire illuminated the night in a hellish, strobing orange glow. Gunfire cracked like thunder. From the roof of the jailhouse, Silas Thorne was fighting a one-man war. Even through the smoke and the terror, Ellie could see him. He was a terrifying force of nature, his Winchester rifles spitting fire as he laid down a relentless barrage of cover fire, trying to keep Croft's men away from the fleeing civilians. He wasn't the cold, detached lawman from the afternoon. He was a warrior defending his people, his face a mask of soot, sweat, and lethal determination. "My boy! Where is my boy?" The hysterical scream tore Ellie's attention away from Silas. A woman, Mrs. Miller, the baker's wife, was clawing at the dirt in the middle of the street, her eyes wide with unimaginable horror as she stared down the road toward the blazing schoolhouse. "Toby ran back to get his whittling knife. He's in the school!" she shrieked, struggling against two men who were trying to hold her back from running into the inferno. Ellie didn't think. The sophisticated, measured logic of Boston evaporated, replaced entirely by the raw, desperate instinct of the frontier. She grabbed a heavy wool blanket that someone had dropped in the dirt, dunked it entirely into a horse trough that hadn't yet been shot to pieces, and threw the soaking heavy mass over her head and shoulders. "Ellie, no!" Cora screamed, lunging for her. But Ellie was already running. She sprinted down the middle of the chaotic street, dodging panicked horses and flying embers. A bullet whipped past her ear, close enough to sever a strand of her hair, but she didn't slow down. The schoolhouse was a towering inferno. The heat radiating off the old dry timber was a physical wall pushing against her, singeing her eyelashes, and making the air in her lungs feel like inhaled glass. The front door had already burned away. Ellie ducked her head under the wet blanket and plunged into the fire. The roar inside was deafening, a monstrous living sound that consumed all other noise. The ceiling was a canopy of rolling orange and black. Flaming debris crashed to the floor around her, sending up geysers of sparks. "Toby!" Ellie screamed, her throat instantly raw from the toxic smoke. "Toby? Where are you?" She crawled on her hands and knees beneath the thickest layer of smoke, the blistered skin on her palms screaming in agony as she scrambled over burning splinters. She navigated by memory, heading toward the back supply closet. A muffled, terrified sobbing reached her ears over the roar of the flames. "Toby?" Ellie scrambled to the closet. The door was jammed, the frame warped by the intense heat. She threw her entire body weight against it once, twice, 3 times. With a splintering crack, the door gave way. 10-year-old Toby was huddled in the corner, clutching a small wooden carving, his eyes rolling back in his head from smoke inhalation. "I've got you," Ellie choked out, pulling the boy into her arms and throwing half of the soaking wet blanket over his small frame. "Keep your eyes closed, Toby. Do not breathe." She hauled him up, wrapping her arms tightly around him. But as she turned back toward the entrance, a massive burning support beam crashed down from the rafters, obliterating the center aisle and completely blocking their path to the door. A wall of solid fire rose between them and the exit. They were trapped. Ellie backed up against the far wall, clutching the boy to her chest. The heat was becoming unbearable, the wet blanket rapidly drying out and beginning to steam. Panic, cold and absolute, finally seized her heart. "This is it," she thought, closing her eyes as the flames licked closer. "I brought the fire, and now it's going to consume me." Suddenly, the burning wall of debris was violently blasted apart. A massive figure charged through the flames, wielding the heavy iron fireplace poker like a broadsword to smash the burning timbers out of the way. It was Silas. His gray duster was singed and smoking, his hat gone, his face blackened with soot and smeared with blood from a cut on his forehead. He looked like an avenging angel clawing his way out of hell. "Ellie!" His roar was louder than the fire, fueled by a terror she had never heard from him before. He found her in the corner. He didn't say another word. He scooped Toby up into his left arm, ignoring the searing pain of his bullet graze, and wrapped his massive right arm entirely around Ellie, pulling her tight against his chest. "Hold your breath and close your eyes," Silas commanded. He tucked her head beneath his chin, using his own body as a physical shield against the flames, and charged blindly back through the inferno. The heat was absolute agony. Burning embers rained down on them, searing through Ellie's dress. The structure around them was groaning, the final death rattle of the building. Silas kicked the remaining debris out of the doorway and lunged out into the cool night air, dragging Ellie and Toby with him. They hit the dirt of the street just as the roof of the schoolhouse caved in with a catastrophic roar, sending a pillar of sparks hundreds of feet into the night sky. The concussive wave of heat washed over them, but they were clear. Silas rolled, shielding them from the blast. Townsfolk rushed forward, grabbing Toby and carrying the coughing, crying boy back to his mother. Ellie lay in the dirt, gasping for oxygen, her lungs burning, her vision swimming with black spots. She tried to push herself up, but her arms gave out. Strong hands gripped her shoulders, hauling her up into a sitting position behind the cover of a heavy wooden water trough. It was Silas. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving as he scanned her face, his pale eyes wild and dilated with leftover adrenaline. "Are you hit? Did you burn?" he demanded, his hands frantically checking her arms, her shoulders, tilting her face up to the firelight. I'm all right," Ellie coughed, her hands coming up to grip his forearms. "Silas, the town To hell with the town, Silas snarled, his voice breaking. The stoic, unbreakable sheriff was gone. The man kneeling in front of her was stripped bare, entirely undone by the sheer paralyzing terror of almost losing her to the flames, the exact same way he had lost his family. He stared at her, taking in her soot-stained cheeks, her singed hair, and the fierce, undeniable life blazing in her eyes. The lie of her name didn't matter anymore. The Pinkertons didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that she was breathing. Silas let out a ragged, desperate sound. He threaded his hands into her hair, gripping the back of her head, and pulled her to him. His mouth crashed down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate, bruising, and tasted of ash, sweat, and blood. It was an explosion of every emotion they had been holding back for weeks. The fear, the betrayal, the undeniable magnetic gravity that had been pulling them together since the train platform. Ellie gasped into his mouth, but she didn't pull away. She surged upward, wrapping her arms around his thick neck, anchoring her fingers into his soot-stiffened hair. She kissed him back with equal ferocity, pouring all her defiance, all her apologies, and all her profound, undeniable longing into the embrace. For a few stolen seconds amidst the gunfire and the burning ruins of Dusty Creek, they were the only two people left in the world. When Silas finally pulled back, he kept his forehead pressed hard against hers, both of them breathing in ragged, heavy gasps. His eyes were squeezed shut, his large hands trembling as they gripped her waist. "I thought I lost you," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of 5 years of grief. "I'm right here," Ellie promised, her voice thick with tears. "I'm right here." A bullet struck the water trough behind them, showering them in splintered wood and cold water. The moment shattered. The war was still raging. Silas's eyes snapped open, the lethal, calculating lawman returning in an instant. But this time, when he looked at her, there were no walls. There was only absolute certainty. "Stay down," Silas commanded, drawing his Colt and standing up to return fire into the dark. "I'm going to end this." Dawn crept over the Nevada horizon, not with a gentle glow, but with a bruised, sickly gray light that illuminated the catastrophic cost of the night. Dusty Creek was a graveyard of smoking timber and white ash. The schoolhouse was completely gone, reduced to a blackened stone chimney jutting into the sky like a rotten tooth. Half of Main Street, including Cora's boarding house, was severely damaged. Judson Croft and Arthur Pendleton had pulled their men back to the Double C Ranch before sunrise, leaving the devastation behind as a promise. "Give us the girl and the deed, or tonight we finish the job." The townspeople moved like ghosts through the smoke, hauling buckets of water to douse the remaining hot spots. There was anger in their eyes, but surprisingly, it wasn't directed at Ellie. When Toby's mother had hugged Ellie, sobbing her thanks, the town had made its silent decision. Croft had crossed a line. You didn't burn children. Inside the sheriff's office, the air was heavy and thick with the smell of iodine and blood. Silas stood shirtless by the wash basin, a fresh, tight bandage wrapped around his chest where a piece of shrapnel had caught him, and another securing the bullet graze on his shoulder. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying resolve. Ellie sat on the edge of the cot in the holding cell, her hands wrapped in clean white gauze, watching him strap his heavy gun belt around his hips. "You can't ride out there alone," Ellie said, her voice raspy from the smoke. "Arthur has a dozen Pinkertons. Croft has 20 ranch hands. They control Rattlesnake Canyon, and that's the only way to the territorial capital. It's suicide, Silas." "It's the only play left," Silas said, not looking at her as he meticulously checked the cylinder of his Colt. "I have the 1861 deed in the safe. I take it to Carson City, hand it directly to the federal marshal, and file federal arson and attempted murder charges against Croft and Pendleton. Once the feds step in, Croft's bought and paid for local judges can't protect him." "They will ambush you in the canyon before you make it 10 miles, Ellie pleaded, standing up and crossing the room. She grabbed his wrist, forcing him to look at her. "You are walking into a firing squad." Silas looked down at her small, bandaged hands gripping his arm. The fierce tenderness from the night before was still there in his eyes, buried beneath a layer of grim duty. He reached up, his rough fingers gently tracing the soot-stained line of her cheekbone. "I lost one family to the fire, Ellie," he said softly, the words carrying a devastating finality. "I spent 5 years wishing I had been the one in the flames instead of them. I finally have a reason to fight again. I will not let you or this town burn because I was too afraid to ride out. Silas." "The town will hide you in the root cellar of the church," he continued, his tone brokering no argument. "Croft wants the deed, and Pendleton wants you. If I ride out with the deed, I draw their fire. I'm leaving at first light tomorrow. You are staying here, where it's safe." He leaned down and pressed a firm, lingering kiss to her forehead, a brand of protection and a silent goodbye. Then he guided her gently back to the cot in the back room. "Sleep. You're exhausted." Silas walked out to the front office, locking the heavy iron door between the back room and the front desk. He slumped into his wooden chair, the sheer physical toll of the last 24 hours finally catching up to him. He rested his head on his arms on the desk, intending to only rest his eyes for a moment. Within minutes, the deep, rhythmic breathing of an exhausted man filled the room. In the back room, Ellie lay in the dark, her eyes wide open. "If I ride out with the deed, I draw their fire." His words echoed in her mind. Silas was a brilliant tactician, but he was blinded by his need to protect her. He thought he was being a shield, but Ellie knew the ruthless arithmetic of men like Arthur Pendleton. Arthur didn't care about a town's water rights. He cared about his pride, his control, and the Vance fortune. If Silas rode into that canyon, they would slaughter him just to make a point. Ellie sat up. The sophisticated, trembling heiress who had stepped off the train a month ago was dead, burned away in the fires of Dusty Creek. The woman who remained was forged of Nevada iron and soot. She wasn't going to let Silas Thorne die for her ghosts. She slipped off the cot, wincing as her blistered feet hit the floorboards. She moved to the barred window separating the back room from the front office. Silas was deeply asleep at his desk, his breathing heavy and even. Ellie reached through the bars. Silas always kept the heavy iron ring of keys hanging on a peg just inches from the cell door. It was a terrible habit she had scolded him for a week ago. Now she prayed for his negligence. Stretching her arm as far as it would go, her bandaged fingers brushed the cold iron. She hooked the ring with her index finger and lifted it off the peg with agonizing slowness, terrified they would clink together. Click. She eased the key into the lock of the door separating them. It turned with a soft, well-oiled snick. Ellie pushed the door open and stepped into the main office. She moved with the silent, practiced grace of a woman who had spent a lifetime tiptoeing around her father's explosive temper. She bypassed Silas completely and knelt in front of the heavy iron Mosler safe in the corner. She didn't need the combination. In the chaos of the night, Silas hadn't spun the dial all the way. She simply pulled the heavy handle. It opened with a muted creak. Inside, wrapped in its oilcloth, was the 1861 deed. Ellie pulled it out, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a deep breath, steeling her nerves. She stood up and moved to the coat rack. Silas's iconic bullet-grazed gray canvas duster hung there, smelling of wood smoke and him. She slipped her arms into the heavy coat. It was massive on her, the hem sweeping the floor, the broad shoulders swallowing her small frame. She buttoned it up to her chin to hide her dress. Next, she took his low-brimmed Stetson from the desk, carefully avoiding brushing his sleeping arm, and pulled it down firmly over her dark hair, hiding her features entirely in shadow. Finally, she pulled a piece of sheriff's stationery from the desk drawer and picked up a pen. Her bandaged hand shook, but she forced her handwriting to remain steady. "Silas, you told me I belonged here, but my past followed me and brought hell to your doorstep. You cannot save me by dying in a canyon. Arthur wants me. Croft wants the deed. I am giving them both. Do not follow me until the sun is high. Gather the men. By the time they realize I am not you, you will have the time you need to flank them. I love you. That is the only truth I have ever told in this town. Ellie. She folded the note and placed it precisely in the center of his desk, right beneath his resting hand. Ellie slipped out the back door of the jailhouse into the freezing, pre-dawn darkness. The town was silent, exhausted from the fire. She made her way to the livery, which had thankfully survived the blaze. She didn't saddle a horse. It would take too much time and make too much noise. She grabbed the reins of a sturdy roan mare, leading the horse out of town by foot until they were a mile out, swallowed by the vast, empty expanse of the desert. Only then did she mount up. The wind howled through the scrub brush, biting through the heavy canvas of Silas's duster. Ahead of her, the jagged black teeth of Rattlesnake Canyon loomed against the lightning gray sky. It was the perfect choke point, the perfect place for an ambush. Ellie checked the small, double-barreled Derringer she had tucked into her boot, a gift from Cora she had kept hidden even from Silas. 2 shots. It wasn't enough to fight an army, but it was enough to make Arthur Pendleton bleed. She spurred the horse forward, riding directly into the crosshairs of the East Coast and the West, wearing the badge of the man she loved over a heart that was finally, truly free. The decoy was in play. The mouth of Rattlesnake Canyon gaped open like a jagged black wound against the lightning gray of the Nevada dawn. Towering walls of red sandstone rose on either side, casting long, suffocating shadows over the narrow trail. It was a perfect choke point, the kind of place where a man could disappear and never be found. Ellie Vance pulled Silas's oversized Stetson lower over her eyes and urged the roan mare forward into the gorge. The heavy canvas duster swallowed her small frame, the hem brushing against the stirrups. To anyone watching from the high ridges, she was just a lone rider in a gray coat, carrying the original 1861 deed in her breast pocket. The silence in the canyon was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of her horse's hooves on the loose shale. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept her right hand resting casually near her thigh, inches from the small twin-barreled Derringer Cora had given her, currently hidden inside the shaft of her leather boot. Just a little further, she prayed. Draw them as far away from Dusty Creek as possible. She made it exactly a half-mile deep into the gorge. A sharp, high-pitched whistle echoed off the canyon walls. Before the sound even faded, the trap snapped shut. A rifle shot cracked through the frigid morning air, striking the dirt a mere inch from her mare's front hooves. The horse screamed, rearing up violently. Ellie lost her grip on the reins. She was thrown backward, hitting the hard, unforgiving earth with a bone-jarring thud. The wind was knocked entirely out of her lungs. She gasped, her vision swimming with black spots. The Stetson had flown off her head, her dark hair tumbling free from its pins. Before she could even attempt to sit up, the thunder of approaching hooves filled the narrow pass. Men on horseback poured out from the hidden crevices and switchbacks. 7 Pinkertons, rifles leveled, formed a tight, lethal semicircle around her. "Don't move a muscle, Thorne," one of the mercenaries barked, cocking the lever of his Winchester. "Hands where I can see them." Ellie didn't move. She lay in the dust, her breathing ragged, staring up at the barrels of their guns. The sound of a slower, more deliberate horse approached. The Pinkertons parted to let their employer through. Arthur Pendleton rode forward on his pristine chestnut thoroughbred flanked by Judson Croft. Arthur looked immensely pleased with himself, a cruel, victorious smile playing on his lips. "Well, well, Sheriff," Arthur sneered, looking down at the figure in the dust. "You really are a fool. Did you think you could ride through my canyon with that deed and play the hero? I told you what happens to men who get in my way." Ellie slowly pushed herself up onto her elbows. The oversized duster slipped off her shoulder. She tilted her chin up, the early morning light catching the sharp, aristocratic lines of her face, smudged with dirt and soot from the town fire. She looked Arthur dead in the eye. Arthur's smug smile vanished. The color drained completely from his face. leaving him a sickly, pale white. "Eleanor?" he breathed, the absolute shock rendering him momentarily speechless. Judson Croft spurred his horse forward, his face contorting in rage. "That ain't the sheriff. Where the hell is Thorne?" "He's exactly where he needs to be," Ellie said, her voice raspy but coated in pure East Coast ice. She pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the rifles pointed at her chest. She dusted off the gray canvas coat with deliberate, agonizing slowness. "And you, Arthur, are exactly as gullible as you were in Boston." Arthur's shock violently mutated into a dark, ugly fury. He dismounted his horse in one fluid motion and stormed toward her. Before she could brace herself, his hand lashed out, gripping her upper arm with a bruising, vicious force. "You insolent little bitch," Arthur hissed, his perfectly manicured fingers digging into her flesh. "You dressed up in his coat to play a decoy? You risked your life for some filthy, unwashed frontier lawman?" "I risked my life to stop you," Ellie shot back, refusing to flinch. She leaned in, her eyes blazing with a fire that made Arthur momentarily step back. "And to make sure Silas Thorne had enough time to rally a posse. They are coming for you, Arthur, both of you." Croft cursed vividly, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "She's bluffing. Thorne's a lone wolf. The town is too busy putting out fires to ride out here. Search her for the deed." Pinkerton stepped forward, but Arthur held up a hand. "I'll handle my fiancée." He reached into the inner pocket of the duster and pulled out the oilcloth-wrapped bundle. He tossed it to Croft. "There is your water, Judson, and here is my $42,000. Arthur hauled Ellie roughly toward his horse. "Bind her hands. We're taking her back to the ranch. I have papers that need signing before we put a bullet in her beloved sheriff." An hour later, Ellie was shoved into the main parlor of Judson Croft's sprawling ranch house. It was a grotesque monument to stolen wealth. Imported Persian rugs laid over rough-hewn floorboards, crystal decanters sitting on cheap pine tables. The air smelled of stale cigar smoke and old leather. Arthur threw her into a heavy leather armchair. Her wrists were bound tightly in front of her with coarse rope, the fibers biting into the blisters she had earned scrubbing the schoolhouse floor. She didn't cry out. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Arthur paced in front of the stone fireplace, pouring himself a generous measure of Croft's bourbon. Croft himself was outside, shouting orders at his ranch hands to fortify the perimeter, just in case Ellie's threat of a posse wasn't a bluff. "You have truly embarrassed me, Eleanor," Arthur said, taking a sip of the amber liquid. He picked up a thick manila folder from the desk and dropped it onto the small table beside her chair. He placed a silver fountain pen on top of it. "The lengths I have had to go to retrieve you, the money I have spent on these mercenaries. You will spend the rest of your miserable life in Boston, making it up to me." "I am never going back to Boston," Ellie said flatly. "Oh, but you are," Arthur chuckled, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. The smell of bourbon on his breath made her stomach turn. "Because if you do not sign those transfer papers, transferring your mother's trust into my control, I will tell Croft to ride into Dusty Creek and finish what he started last night. I will burn that boarding house to the ground with Cora inside it, and I will personally put a bullet between Sheriff Thorne's eyes." Ellie looked at the papers. This was the trap she had run 3,000 miles to avoid. The gilded cage. But as she looked at Arthur, she realized something profound. She wasn't terrified of him anymore. In Boston, his cruelty had seemed omnipotent. Here, against the backdrop of the brutal, unforgiving frontier, he just looked small. He was a coward who hid behind hired guns and legal documents. He didn't know how to survive. "You don't understand this place, Arthur," Ellie said softly, a genuine note of pity entering her voice. "Sign the papers, Eleanor." "Men like Silas Thorne don't die just because you pay someone to shoot them," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "And women who survive the frontier don't sign away their souls because a man threatens them in a parlor." Arthur's eyes darkened. He raised his hand, fully intending to strike her across the face. But before his hand could fall, the distant, unmistakable crack of a Winchester rifle shattered the morning air. Arthur froze. Another shot rang out, followed immediately by a chorus of overlapping gunfire. A window in the adjacent dining room exploded inward, showering the Persian rug in glittering shards of glass. "They're here!" a Pinkerton screamed from the front porch, right before the heavy thud of a body hitting the floorboards echoed through the house. Ellie smiled, a fierce, feral expression that made Arthur's blood run cold. "I told you, Arthur," she whispered over the rising din of the gunfight. "You're in the West now, and the law just caught up with you." The smell of smoke still hung heavy in the sheriff's office when Silas Thorne bolted upright at his desk. He gasped, his hand instinctively dropping to the empty holster on his hip. He blinked against the harsh morning sunlight streaming through the window. He had fallen asleep. The sheer exhaustion of the fire had dragged him under against his will. Panic seized his chest. He stood up, wincing as his wounded shoulder protested violently. "Ellie!" he called out, striding toward the back room. The holding cell was empty. The cot was unmade. Silas spun around, his eyes scanning the office. The safe door was wide open, the 1861 deed gone. His gray duster and Stetson were missing from the coat rack. And sitting dead center on his desk, weighted down by a single bullet, was a folded piece of paper. Silas snatched it up. He read her elegant, sloping handwriting. "I am giving them both. Do not follow me until the sun is high. Gather the men. I love you. That is the only truth I have ever told in this town." Silas's hands shook. He crushed the letter in his fist, a sound tearing from his throat that was half roar, half sob. It was the sound of a man whose heart had been ripped out of his chest for the second time in his life. She hadn't betrayed him. She had sacrificed herself. She had ridden into a canyon filled with armed killers to buy him the time he needed, wearing his coat as a target. Silas didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for the sun to be high. He strapped on his gun belt, grabbed his Winchester, and kicked the front door of the jailhouse open. Dusty Creek was already awake. The townsfolk were gathered in the street, covered in soot, assessing the charred ruins of the schoolhouse and the damaged storefronts. They were exhausted, broken, and simmering with a dark, communal rage. Silas walked into the center of the street. He didn't need to shout. The sheer, terrifying aura of violence radiating from him silenced the crowd instantly. "Judson Croft burned our town last night." Silas's voice boomed, hard and unforgiving as iron. "He tried to burn our children. And this morning, his men and a squad of Pinkertons ambushed Eleanor Vance in Rattlesnake Canyon. She took the deed to draw them off so we could survive." A ripple of shock and profound anger swept through the crowd. Cora stepped forward, a double-barreled shotgun resting casually over her flour-dusted apron. "They have her at the Double C Ranch," Silas continued, his pale eyes sweeping over the men of the town. "I swore an oath to uphold the law. But the law doesn't mean a damn thing if the people who enforce it let monsters burn down their homes. I am riding out to Croft's ranch. I am bringing Ellie back, and I am ending this. Whoever wants to stand with me, mount up." He didn't have to ask twice. Within 10 minutes, a posse of 30 heavily armed, enraged townsfolk was riding hard out of Dusty Creek. There were ranchers, miners, shopkeepers, and cowboys. They didn't have matching suits or corporate funding, but they had the righteous, unstoppable fury of a community that had been pushed too far. They hit the Double C Ranch like a localized hurricane. Silas didn't bother with a parley. As they crested the ridge overlooking Croft's sprawling compound, Silas raised his Winchester and fired a single shot that shattered the front parlor window. "Take the perimeter," Silas roared to his deputies and the townsfolk. "Nobody in a suit leaves this valley alive." Chaos erupted. The Pinkertons, accustomed to intimidating unarmed strikers back east, were entirely unprepared for the sheer ferocity of a frontier posse. Gunfire echoed like thunder across the basin. Smoke rapidly filled the air. Silas rode his black gelding straight through the wooden gates of the compound, firing with deadly mechanical precision from the saddle. He swung down from his horse before it even fully stopped, taking cover behind a heavy water trough. He reloaded his Colt, his eyes fixed on the heavy oak front doors of the main house. She was in there. He could feel it in his bones. Silas kicked the front doors open, splintering the lock. The parlor was a haze of gun smoke and dust. Judson Croft was cowering behind a heavy mahogany desk, desperately trying to reload a revolver. Silas didn't even break stride. He fired once, the bullet shattering Croft's kneecap. The cattle baron went down screaming, his gun sliding across the floor. "Where is she?" Silas snarled, stepping over the writhing man. "Right here, Sheriff." Silas froze. At the far end of the room, near the massive stone fireplace, Arthur Pendleton stood with his back to the wall. His pristine suit was covered in dust, his face slick with the sweat of pure panic. But it wasn't Arthur that made Silas's blood run cold. Arthur had his left arm wrapped tightly around Ellie's throat, using her as a human shield. In his right hand, he held a silver-plated revolver, the barrel pressed flush against Ellie's temple. Ellie's hands were still bound in front of her. Her face was pale, but her eyes were remarkably calm. "Drop the gun, Thorne!" Arthur screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Drop it, or I blow her brains out right now!" Silas's world tunneled down to the terrifying image of the gun pressed against Ellie's head. The nightmare was repeating. He was standing in the ashes of his life, entirely powerless to save the woman he loved. His finger hovered over the trigger of his Colt. If he missed by a fraction of an inch, Ellie died. "I said drop it!" Arthur yelled, cocking the hammer of his gun. The click echoed agonizingly loud in the sudden quiet of the room. Silas slowly lowered his Colt. He couldn't risk it. He couldn't lose her. He opened his hand, preparing to let his weapon fall to the floor. But as he looked at Ellie, her eyes locked onto his. She didn't look terrified. She looked fiercely, intensely focused. She blinked slowly, holding his gaze. "Breathe." The memory of the limestone canyon flashed through Silas's mind. Take the time the world gives you. Nothing else exists but the front sight and the target. Ellie shifted her weight imperceptibly. Her bound hands resting in her lap moved just a fraction. Silas saw it. The silent signal. He didn't drop his gun. Instead, he tightened his grip, his muscles coiling like a spring. Ellie suddenly dropped her entire body weight, collapsing her knees and ripping herself forcefully downward out of Arthur's chokehold. Arthur stumbled forward, thrown off balance, his gun waving wildly for a fraction of a second. In that split second, Ellie's bound hands snapped up from her boot. The small, deadly derringer she had concealed was clutched between her palms. Without hesitating, she pointed it point blank at Arthur's leg and squeezed the trigger. Bang! Arthur shrieked in agony as the small caliber bullet tore through his thigh. He collapsed, his grip on his revolver failing as he fell to the Persian rug. Silas moved with the speed of a striking viper. He closed the distance in 2 massive strides, kicking the silver revolver out of Arthur's reach. He grabbed the East Coast billionaire by the lapels of his ruined suit, hauling him halfway off the floor, and drove a punishing, bone-crushing right hook directly into Arthur's jaw. Arthur crumpled to the floor, unconscious before he even hit the wood. The room went deathly still. Outside, the gunfire had ceased. The townsfolk had secured the compound. Silas stood over the bodies of the 2 men who had tried to burn his world down. His chest heaved, his breathing ragged. Slowly, he turned around. Ellie was sitting on the floor, the smoking derringer slipping from her bound hands. She looked up at him, soot-stained, bruised, and breathtakingly beautiful. Silas dropped to his knees in front of her. He pulled a hunting knife from his belt and sliced through the thick ropes binding her wrists. The moment her hands were free, she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in the hollow of his shoulder. Silas crushed her to his chest, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her like it was the only oxygen left on earth. He held her with a desperate, crushing force, his massive frame trembling violently. "You crazy, reckless, beautiful fool," Silas choked out, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I told you not to fight alone." "I wasn't alone," Ellie whispered, her tears soaking into his blood-stained shirt as she pulled back to look into his eyes. I knew you would come. I knew you would never let me go. Silas framed her face in his large, calloused hands. The walls were gone. The ghosts were finally laid to rest. He leaned in and kissed her, a deep, reverent promise sealed in the smoke and dust of the frontier. Never, he swore against her lips. You're mine, Ellie, and this is exactly where you belong. The dust in Nevada never truly settled. It simply waited for the wind to carry it somewhere new. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the air in Dusty Creek tasted clean. 3 days had passed since the shootout at the Double C Ranch. The federal marshals had arrived from Carson City just before noon, their badges gleaming in the harsh sunlight. They had taken Judson Croft, heavily bandaged and completely stripped of his arrogant bluster, and loaded him into a prison wagon. Arthur Pendleton had been next. He limped heavily, his leg crudely wrapped, his tailored suit ruined beyond recognition. As the marshals shoved him toward the wagon, Arthur locked eyes with Ellie, who stood on the boardwalk beside Silas. There was no power left in Arthur's pale gaze. Only the pathetic, hollow realization that his East Coast money could not buy his way out of a federal kidnapping and attempted murder charge in the untamed West. Ellie didn't gloat. She simply turned her back on him, severing the final invisible chain that had kept her bound to Boston. That evening, the town gathered around a massive bonfire in the center of Main Street. It wasn't a celebration of destruction, but of survival. The ruins of the schoolhouse and Cora's boarding house had been cleared away, the charred timber piled high and set ablaze to make room for new foundations. Silas stood a few paces away from the crowd, his thumbs hooked into his gun belt. His shoulder and chest were tightly bound beneath a clean chambray shirt, the pain a dull throb he easily ignored. His pale eyes were fixed entirely on Ellie. She stood near the edge of the roaring fire, the orange light dancing across her face. In her hands, she held the thick cream-colored manila envelope Arthur had brought to the ranch. The legal transfer of the Vance Shipping Trust, $42,000. Silas stepped up silently behind her, the heat of the fire washing over them both. The marshals are officially out of the valley, Silas said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated pleasantly in her chest. Pendleton will face a federal judge by Tuesday. He's looking at 20 years in a territorial penitentiary. He'll never touch you again. I know, Ellie murmured, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. She looked down at the envelope in her hands. It represented unimaginable wealth. It meant luxury, safety, and a life of total ease on the eastern seaboard. With Arthur gone, she could theoretically return to Boston and claim it all without fear. Without a second of hesitation, Ellie tossed the heavy envelope directly into the center of the bonfire. Silas's eyebrows arched slightly as the thick parchment curled, blackened, and erupted into bright yellow flames. That was a small fortune you just burned, Miss Vance. It was a leash, Silas, Ellie said, turning to face him. A brilliant, unburdened smile broke across her face, making her look breathtakingly alive. My father's money came with my father's rules. I don't want anything I didn't build with my own 2 hands. Silas looked down at her, his heart contracting with a fierce, overwhelming surge of love. He reached out, his rough knuckles gently tracing the line of her jaw. You've got nothing left to your name but the dress on your back and a ruined pair of boots. I have everything I need right here, she whispered, leaning into his touch. He kissed her, slow and deep, ignoring the cheering of the townsfolk around the fire. He poured every unspoken promise into that kiss, swearing silently to spend the rest of his life making sure she never regretted the fortune she had left in the ashes. A week later, the piercing shriek of a steam whistle echoed through the jagged canyons surrounding Dusty Creek. Silas was walking down the newly repaired boardwalk, checking the locks on the assayer's office when the sound hit him. He glanced toward the train depot at the edge of town. The eastbound locomotive, the direct line to Chicago and eventually Boston, was hissing to a halt on the tracks. His eyes scanned the platform, a casual habit born of years of law enforcement. Suddenly, his blood turned to ice. Standing at the far end of the wooden platform, waiting by the passenger car doors, was a slender silhouette in a faded cotton dress. Her dark hair was pinned up neatly. At her feet rested a heavy, worn carpet bag. Ellie. The air was violently sucked from Silas's lungs. The world tilted. The core bleeding wound that he thought had finally healed ripped wide open in an agonizing flash of pure panic. She's leaving. The thought was a physical blow. The adrenaline, the danger, the romance of the frontier had worn off, and the harsh, brutal reality of the West had finally broken her. She was going back to civilization. Silas didn't think. He ran. He sprinted down the center of Main Street, his heavy boots kicking up clouds of dust, ignoring the sharp, tearing pain in his healing shoulder. He pushed past a group of disembarking prospectors, his pale eyes wild and fixed on her back. "Ellie!" he roared over the deafening hiss of the train's steam release. Ellie jumped, spinning around just as the conductor shouted the final boarding call. Silas reached her, his massive hands grabbing her upper arms, pulling her away from the edge of the boarding step. His chest heaved, his breathing ragged, his face entirely undone by a terrifying, naked vulnerability he hadn't shown to anyone in 5 long years. "Silas?" she gasped, her eyes wide with surprise. "What are you doing? Your shoulder—" "Don't do this," Silas choked out, his grip tightening. He didn't care who was watching. He didn't care about his stoic reputation. He was a man fighting for his absolute survival. "I know this place is hard. I know it's dust and blood, and nothing like what you deserve. But I will build you whatever you want. I will tear this earth apart with my bare hands to give you a good life." He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in her hair. His voice broke, reducing the terrifying lawman to a desperate plea. "Don't run, Ellie. Please. This is where you belong." Ellie stood frozen in his arms for a split second, processing the sheer, devastating gravity of his words. And then a soft, beautiful laugh bubbled up from her chest. She pulled back just enough to look up into his panicked eyes. She lifted her hand, gently cupping his rough, unshaven cheek. "Oh, Silas," she murmured, her eyes shining with tears of pure affection. "You wonderful, stubborn, foolish man. Look at me." Silas blinked, his heart still hammering against his ribs. "I am not getting on that train," she said softly, enunciating every word. Silas frowned, his gaze dropping to the heavy carpet bag resting at her feet, then to the train that was beginning to shudder forward. "Then what are you doing on the eastbound platform with your bags?" Ellie stepped out of his embrace. She reached down and picked up the heavy carpet bag. With a grunt of effort, she swung it backward, and then hurled it forward with all her might. The bag flew off the platform, sailing through the air before landing dead center inside the massive iron incinerator barrel the rail workers used to burn the depot trash. Silas stared at the smoking barrel, completely bewildered. "That bag had my East Coast traveling suit, Arthur's train ticket, and every piece of identification that called me Eleanor Vance," Ellie said, dusting her hands off with a satisfied sigh. She turned back to Silas, her eyes sparkling with fierce, unyielding love. "I wasn't leaving, Silas. I was just taking out the trash." The train whistle blew one final time, the massive iron wheels grinding against the tracks as the locomotive pulled away, heading east without her. Silas stared at her, the realization washing over him like a sudden summer rain in the desert. The panic evaporated, replaced by a wave of relief so profound his knees nearly buckled. He let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. "You nearly stopped my heart, East Coast," he rasped. "You don't get to call me that anymore," she whispered, stepping back into his space, wrapping her arms securely around his neck. "I'm a Nevada girl now, Earl." Silas didn't need any more convincing. He swept her up off the ground, his arms wrapping around her waist, and kissed her with a fierce, triumphant passion right there on the platform, surrounded by the dust and the heat of the wild frontier. 6 months later, the winter chill had settled comfortably over the valley. Silas stood on the newly built wraparound porch of their small ranch house, situated on the prime acreage just north of town. He held a steaming mug of black coffee, watching the morning sun paint the jagged peaks of Rattlesnake Canyon in hues of brilliant gold and violet. The town of Dusty Creek had not just survived, it had thrived. Without Croft's stranglehold on the water, new homesteaders had moved in, and right at the end of Main Street stood the crown jewel of the community, a brand new sturdy brick schoolhouse. It hadn't been built with East Coast millions. It had been built by the blistered hands of the townsfolk, funded by a community that refused to be broken. The heavy wooden front door of the cabin creaked open behind him. Ellie stepped out onto the porch, pulling a thick woolen shawl around her shoulders. She slipped her arms around Silas's waist from behind, resting her cheek against the solid, comforting expanse of his back. "You're up early, Sheriff," she murmured sleepily. Silas chuckled, leaning back into her embrace. He turned around, pulling her under his arm and tucking her securely against his side to share his warmth. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her, no longer expensive French perfume, but lye soap, fresh ink, and the undeniable scent of home. "Just watching the sun come up over our town, Mrs. Thorne," Silas said quietly, his pale eyes resting on the distant, glittering ribbon of the creek. Ellie looked out over the rugged, beautiful, unforgiving landscape. She had arrived here with nothing but a fake name and a desperate need to escape. She had found fire, blood, and a love strong enough to rewrite her destiny. "It's going to be a good day," Ellie said, leaning her head on his shoulder. Silas tightened his arm around her, his heart perfectly, permanently anchored. The running was over. The ghosts were dead. They had carved their own slice of heaven out of the dust, and for the rest of their days, they would hold the line together. "Yeah," Silas agreed, his voice a low, steady promise against the Nevada wind. "It is." This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.